The United States has delivered a stark ultimatum to the European Union, a move that could signify the final surrender of the bloc's economic and political sovereignty. The message from Washington is unequivocal. If Europe desires intensified American sanctions against Russia, it must first sever its own remaining energy ties with Moscow. This demand comes at a time when the EU is already grappling with economic turmoil, a direct consequence of its previous decisions to curtail Russian energy imports. As the continent faces an even more precarious economic future, the United States stands to gain significantly, positioning itself to sell more of its liquefied natural gas, LNG, to Europe at prices 2 to 3 times higher than Russian alternatives, thereby tightening its grip on EU policy. US Energy Secretary Chris Wright articulated this position clearly to the Financial Times, stating that Europe's continued reliance on Russian energy directly finances Moscow. Wright's message implies that without decisive action from the EU to halt these purchases, the United States will refrain from escalating economic pressure on Russia. This demonstrates the flexible and powerful nature of sanctions, which are now being wielded as leverage not just against adversaries, but also against allies. The European Union finds itself in an incredible position, effectively being strong-armed into purchasing more expensive American energy, in a move that many see as a form of economic self-harm. The ultimatum couldn't be clearer. As Wright stated, if the Europeans drew a line and said, "We're not going to buy more Russian gas, we're not going to buy Russian oil," would that have a positive influence on the US leaning in more aggressively? Absolutely. The question that hangs in the air is what the EU truly stands to gain from this arrangement, apart from complete energy and political dependence on the United States. Washington's stance suggests this increased dependence is not an unfortunate byproduct, but a desired outcome. This standoff arrives at a critical juncture. After numerous rounds of sanctions that have arguably failed to cripple the Russian economy, the EU is preparing to impose even more, doubling down on a strategy that has contributed to its own economic decline. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has echoed the sentiment from the Energy Department, confirming that the United States is prepared to increase pressure on Russia, but only if Europe takes reciprocal steps. The ball, as they say, is now firmly in the EU's court. In this high-stakes geopolitical game, energy has once again become the central playing piece. Should Europe cease its energy trade with Russia, the United States is ready and waiting to fill the void with its own expensive fossil fuels. Over the past few years, Europe has made significant strides in weaning itself off Russian gas, but this has come at the cost of increasing dependence on the United States. For instance, while Russian gas constituted nearly 40% of the EU's fossil fuel imports in 2022, that figure has dropped. However, a recent uptick in Russian LNG purchases has sounded alarms in Washington. The EU's payments to Russia for energy dropped from €144 billion in 2022 to €6 billion in 2024, 85% decrease, demonstrating a significant shift. Yet, the remaining flow of money is a point of contention. This increase in Russian LNG imports is seen by the Trump administration as a move that undermines the collective Western effort to isolate Moscow economically. The administration is pushing Europe to adhere to the terms of a massive $750 billion energy trade agreement signed in July 2025. This deal compels the EU to purchase that value in American energy products including LNG, oil and nuclear fuels by the end of 2028. With less than 3 years remaining, meeting this target appears to be an immense, if not impossible, challenge. Many analysts have already deemed the goal of importing $250 billion annually as unrealistic, given that total EU energy imports from the UWS in 2024 were just over €60 billion. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has previously indicated the difficulty of this commitment, and UWS Energy Secretary Chris Wright's recent visit to Brussels was intended to press the issue. He met with his EU counterpart Dan Jorgensen and members of the European Parliament, many of whom are advocating for revisions to the trade deal. Their argument is that the agreement disproportionately benefits American interests, a point that is difficult to dispute. Right, however, sees the deal as a long-term change in global energy relations, cementing the EU's dependence on American infrastructure. Energy is not the only source of transatlantic friction. The EU's ambitious climate policy has become another major point of contention. Chris Wright, known disparagingly by environmentalists as Trump's fracker-in-chief, has warned that Brussels' green agenda threatens the very viability of the US-EU trade agreement. He has publicly called Europe's net zero by 2050 policy a colossal train wreck and a monstrous human impoverishment program. The core of the issue lies in new EU green laws, such as the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism (CBAM) and methane regulations, which aim to enforce environmental accountability across global supply chains. Wright argues these create huge legal risks for US fossil fuel exporters, who would need to undertake massive operational changes to comply. In essence, the powerful US oil and gas lobby is pushing back against the trade deal unless the EU reconsiders its environmental policies. This pressure is not born from a concern for European well-being, but for their own profit margins. Last month, reports emerged that corporations like ExxonMobil were urging the Trump administration to leverage the trade talks to weaken or block these EU rules. The administration is taking this a step further. As the EU's economy weakens, the UWs is now blaming the bloc for its own decline, while simultaneously pushing it towards a precipice by demanding a full stop to Russian energy. Wright squarely blames European energy and climate policies for rising prices, economic stagnation, and the deindustrialization of the entire continent. In a statement dripping with cynicism, he claimed the EU's exaggerated activist views of climate change and its bureaucracy have undermined its own energy security and widened the wealth gap with the United States. Despite the external pressure and internal economic pain, the EU leadership appears eager to comply with Washington's demands. The European Commission is actively drafting legal proposals to formalize the phase-out of all Russian oil and gas by 2028. The plummet bills banning new contracts and stopping spot purchases by the end of 2025, with a final deadline of January 1st, 2028 for all imports to cease. However, unity within the EU is fractured. Hungary and Slovakia, heavily reliant on the lower-priced Russian pipeline gas, continue their purchases and have resisted calls for a faster phase-out. Their dependence is stark in 2024, while the rest of the EU drastically cut Russian imports. Hungary and Slovakia's combined imports of Russian crude were 2% higher than in 2021. Recently, Hungary signed its largest ever gas deal with a Western company, Shell, but Foreign Minister Peter Szijjártó made it clear that Russian supplies would continue, citing a lack of alternative infrastructure. This internal division is unfolding against a backdrop of escalating tensions. The Druzhba gas pipeline, which supplies these holdout nations, has been attacked multiple times in recent weeks by Ukrainian forces. The EU's conspicuous silence on these attacks is reminiscent of its muted reaction to the mysterious destruction of the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines. Moscow has warned that these attacks threaten Europe's broader energy security, while Kyiv views them as a legitimate response to the ongoing war. It is becoming increasingly clear that the United States is using the energy crisis as powerful leverage to fundamentally tilt the global balance of power in its favor. The EU appears to be past a point of no return, voluntarily severing the energy lifeline that fueled its prosperity for decades. The energy war is far from over, and the battle for markets, influence, and policy supremacy between Washington and Brussels is only just beginning to heat up. The ultimate question remains, will the EU sacrifice the last vestiges of its economic sovereignty for transatlantic allegiance, or will it find a way to reclaim its autonomy in a world being reshaped by this energy conflict?